What's going on, guys? I've wanted to make this video for quite a while because thinking about my sprint in this way has really helped me develop my sprint over the last couple of years. It's also a good way for you to think about your sprint because a lot of the time when people come to me and they say, oh, my sprint's not good, they're saying sprint as if I kind of know what they mean, but the sprint is actually quite a complex thing in cycling. There's different parts and phases of the sprint. So it's useful to break down what I actually mean by a sprint so you can then more easily be able to work on the specific part of the sprint that you feel you're deficient in. So firstly, what do I mean by sprint? I'm going to be saying a sprint is any max effort under about 20 seconds long. Let's say we'll cap it at 20 seconds. Anything above 20 seconds is probably more like an anaerobic capacity effort. So an actual sprint needs to be sort of 20 seconds and below. The type of sprint I'm talking about here is also something that you might do in training or in a race. Let's say if you're sprinting in a two-up sprint or in a small group. This isn't something you're going to be doing if you're in a big bunch sprint. Like to win a big bunch sprint, you could be sitting on the wheels and come off the wheel for the last 2 seconds. So what I'm talking about here is more about a sprint from a training point of view and also, for a small group sprint or when you're sprinting against your mates. I'm not necessarily talking about every sprint scenario that you're going to go into. This will make a bit more sense as we get into the video. So let's break it down. I like to think of a full sprint as having 3 phases. The first phase being the jump. This is where the bulk of the acceleration is done and this lasts up to about 3 seconds. So this is the first initial couple of pedal strokes where you're really jumping on it and getting yourself up to speed. This is actually probably the part of the sprint that most people have an issue with because there's a lot of things that can kind of go wrong here, whether that's incorrect gear choice, or a lot of people also comment that their back wheel skips and that it takes them a few seconds or a few pedal strokes to feel like they're in control of the bike and then they can put power down. So a lot of people have issues doing a smooth, coordinated jump phase of their sprint. So a couple of things that you can try to improve the jump phase of your sprint. The first thing is try starting before your sprint, be out of the saddle already, because if you're starting your sprint rolling into it in the saddle and then you're kind of getting out of the saddle and trying to coordinate the first pedal stroke, that's a few more things to think about. So if you're having troubles with it, get out of the saddle first, get the movement of the bike side to side, make sure you're comfortable, count yourself in as you're out of the saddle, and then just lean on the first pedal stroke. It simplifies the movement so you're not having to coordinate the standing and then the starting of the first pedal stroke. So that's the first place to start. The other thing with the jump phase is that you don't necessarily need to be super aerodynamic in this phase because this is just about getting the most amount of power through the bike, through the wheels, through the tires, onto the ground as possible to get the most amount of acceleration. Usually, obviously at the start of the sprint, you're not going as fast as you are at the end of the sprint. So your aerodynamic position isn't as important. So in the start jump phase of a sprint, you can be a bit more upright. And also if you're finding your back wheel is skipping a little bit and you're having issues maintaining contact with the ground, try shifting your weight back a little bit further over the back wheel just to help the back wheel stay stable. You only need to do that for the first few pedal strokes until your bike's picked up a bit of speed. Then you can start to shift into the next phase of the sprint. Final thing you can do if you're having issues with the back wheel skipping in this jump phase of the sprint is just do the first 1, 2, or 3 pedal strokes at about 90%. When you're really experienced, you can jump on that first pedal stroke and put everything into it and you'll be fine. But as you're building up, it can be useful just to back off those first few pedal strokes, make sure the rear wheel's staying in contact with the ground. Then once your speed's picked up a little bit after those first few pedal strokes, then you can really lean on it and give your absolute 100% exertion through the pedals, and you should have less issues with the rear wheel skipping. Okay, next phase of the sprint, which takes you from around 3 to 10 seconds, is the drive phase. This is the main portion of the sprint where you already have a bit of acceleration on board, so you're already moving at a decent speed, and this is just about maintaining your absolute max amount of power that you can. So a few things to note here. First one is that you're probably going to have to do a couple of shifts in the drive phase of the gears because as your speed picks up, your cadence is going to increase. Chances are you're going to have to shift. So getting used to shifting as you sprint is something you're going to have to get used to. 2, 1, bang. I don't really have any specific tips about shifting when you're sprinting. Some people think that you shouldn't really shift when you sprint or that you need to do anything special. Modern gears, 11 speed, I mean, I've got Di2, I can kind of shift the rear derailleur however I want while I'm sprinting and it deals with it fine. So shifting while you're sprinting is just a part of executing a sprint and it's something you're gonna have to get used to. Next thing with the dry phase is that up until about 10 seconds, which is the end of what I'm calling the dry phase, it doesn't really hurt. Even though you're putting in like a maximal exertion, you're not really going to be in pain yet until the acidity builds up in your blood and you're getting that build up of pain that you're going to get towards the end of a sprint. So putting out good power in the dry phase is just about focus and exerting yourself. And it does take time to training yourself up not to have the power wean off as you get 5, 6, 7 seconds into a sprint. It's easy to focus for those first few pedal strokes, but actually holding that power down throughout the dry phase does just take focus. There's not much else to say about the dry phase of the sprint. There's not really much going on. You've already accelerated up to speed. This is just about, getting the max amount of power out and getting yourself through this middle part of the sprint, going on to the next phase, which is the finish. So the finish is the last part of a sprint if you're doing a long sprint, anywhere from about 10 to 20 seconds. This is where things firstly start to get a little bit painful. As you get 12, 14, 16 seconds into a sprint, you are going to be in some sort of physical pain and you will have to sort of push through that, get aggressive, get a bit aggro and really exert yourself because you are going to have to be pushing yourself through a pain barrier to hold the power output up. The thing with the finish phase of a sprint though is that you're generally going to be going a lot faster, especially if you're doing a sprint on a flat road. As you get past that 10-second mark, you've already done most of your accelerating, so you're already going at a very fast speed, and your power is going to start to drop off after about 10 seconds. So what you also need to do here is start shifting your body position into a more aerodynamic position. So what you might want to do is start thinking about dropping your head, bending your elbows more, and moving yourself away from that more upright position that you're going to use at the start of the sprint to generate the most amount of power and maintain wheel contact with the ground. Now you're already up to speed, power is starting to naturally drop off as you fatigue. You need to shift yourself into that more aerodynamic position, and that's going to help you get the most speed out of yourself in the last phase of the sprint. This doesn't need to be anything crazy like a Caleb Ewan right over the front of the bars. Just a subtle change, bending your elbows more, getting your back down and getting used to sprinting in that position. It's definitely something you're going to have to train to hold yourself while you're sprinting in a slightly more aerodynamic position. It's just something to be thinking about and to go and train in your sprints. One of the other really important parts of having a good finish of your sprint is being able to sprint and put out good power at a high cadence. This is important because as your speed picks up, firstly, you may simply run out of gears. Like if the road starts going downhill, you might be in the 53.11 and start to be spinning it out. So it's useful to be able to sprint at a high cadence. But the other thing is, if you can sprint at a high cadence, it means you're less reliant on shifting to constantly be going into a bigger gear. Because let's say if your best sprint power outputs, you're hitting at say 90 RPM, and as soon as you go to like 110, 120, you can't coordinate the sprint, you're going to have to shift so many times throughout the sprint so you can keep your cadence low. So being able to you're still always going to have to shift in a sprint, maybe 1 or 2 shifts. But if you can sprint really well at 120, 130 RPM, it means you might just do 1 or 2 shifts at the start of the sprint, and then you can just get full focus, aero position, high cadence, keeping the power down and not have to worry about doing 3, 4, 5 different shifts throughout the sprint, which are going to impact your power output in some way. Being able to sprint at a high cadence is just something you're going to have to practice. So just as you might do some overgeared sprints to build your ability to produce torque and muscular power, you also want to include sprints where you're doing a higher cadence, getting used to sprinting at 120, 130 RPM in your more aerodynamic sprint position so that you're less reliant on shifting. It'll make you a better sprinter overall. So I think that pretty much covers it. Final thing I'll say is next time you're going and doing a sprint, or if you feel like you're not great at sprinting, have a think about what part of the sprint in particular you're actually struggling with, so you can then work on that in particular. Just saying you're not good at sprinting as a whole isn't really a good way to improve because that's such a broad thing to be covering. So that's all for this video, guys. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.